Good afternoon to all the participants. I also welcome Professor Mohsin Khan and all my colleagues today in today's webinar forum. Today's webinar is on the topic, what is realism in politics and international relation? And this will be presented by Professor Mohsin Khan. Professor Mohsin Khan is an associate professor at Jindal School of International Affairs, and he's also an assistant dean for the student uh, engagement as well. So I would now request Professor Mohsin Khan to start with his presentation. Post his presentation, we would also be taking questions related to the topic. Thank you.
Okay. How long can I speak for?
So you can speak for 20-25 minutes, and then we take the question answers.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm going to cover a very important topic. This is one of the main theories. Realism is one of the main theories of political science and international relations. There are other major theories as well. There's a theory called liberalism, and there's another theory called constructivism. Then there are feminist theories, etc., Marxist. But right now, the three most common theories are realism, liberalism, and constructivism. So what is realism as a theory? Now the question arises. So realism is also has many subgroups within realism. What is known as classical realism is something which starts at the time of the Greeks. Now, some people might object that why is this starting from the Europeans only? Because sure, there are realists everywhere. Realism believes it's a theory of human nature, that it is natural, and therefore it is practiced in all ages. And India has its own examples. For example, Chanakya Niti, and in ancient Greece, this was first written down as a kind of text. So there was a war between two states, two superpowers of that time in ancient Greece. I'm sure many of you have heard the names. One was called Sparta, and the other was called Athens. The Greek states consisted of many small states, and some of them were little bigger than cities. But these were the two most powerful states. Athens was a state which had a powerful navy and a powerful trading economy, whereas Sparta was a more land-based and army-heavy, infantry-heavy force. They fought for supremacy, and this war is called the Peloponnesian War. And one of the generals who fought in this war was a man called Thucydides or Thucydides. He wrote a book called The History of the Peloponnesian Wars. And this is supposed to be the first classical text of realism. So he, for example, does not take the assistance of any kind of superstition or God or divine element. He analyzes the entire war on the basis of the interactions and the decisions made by human beings, and why some of the decisions proved successful and why others proved unsuccessful or sometimes disastrous. So, so what are the principles? What are these principles on which it is based? So primarily, realism is a theory which believes that human beings are ultimately selfish. It's not a very optimistic theory. It tells you that in any situation, whether it is domestic politics or international politics, look for where self-interest lies, where the person or the group's self-interest lies, and you will be able to better understand what is happening. So keep your eye on the people's self-interest. The second view is keep an eye on who has power in a particular situation. Hello? Can you hear my voice?
Yes, Professor Khan, you're audible. You're loud and clear.
Okay. So in any situation, please keep your eye on who has power in that situation. So realism ultimately becomes a theory of power. Once you know who has more power, who has less power, who has no power, who has the most power, which group, then keeping in mind their self-interest, you can make strategy and you can see what is happening in a situation. So in international relations, we start with classical realism, and then there are some modern theories of realism, which I will come to very soon. Okay. Now, in international relations, they say that keep in mind uh, three aspects of realism. Realism has three aspects. I've put all those three aspects on the screen right now. The first aspect is called groupism. That is, human beings basically need to put themselves in groups in order to survive, because individual human beings are weak. Even ever since we were hunter-gatherers, we have made tribes. There's a particular reason for that, because individuals are weak, so you have to put yourself in a group. That is, humans face one another mainly as members of groups. So people need this cohesion for security. But this security that they get from being in a group also creates conflict. Why? Because, for example, today the most important groups are nation states. And what they use for cohesion is something called nationalism, a feeling that they generate. Now, these groups will automatically come in conflict with other groups. Why? So there are various theories within realism which give you an answer for that. Groups automatically generate fear in other groups. That is, if you are a powerful group, you automatically generate fear in someone else. Okay? Why? Because of the second assumption of egoism that realism makes. Egoism is that ultimately people are self-interested. When push comes to shove, egoism always tends to trump altruism, right? Because egoism, apparently, according to realism, is rooted in human nature. That is, as long as there is no conflict or resources are many, you may feel people are a bit generous. But the moment there is any pressure, as you have seen right now in this COVID crisis, all countries are right now jumping to get the medical equipment for their own people, whatever is scarce in their country. They're quickly trying to scramble and collect it for themselves. The third aspect, I've already spoken about that, of realism is power centricism. That is, power is the fundamental feature of politics. It is the most important feature of politics. Once you're made groups, there will be some kind of inequalities between groups. There will be some kind of inequalities even between individuals. That is, there'll be more, some people will have more social power, or some will have more economic power, or some will have more physical power, you know, and they will exert this to grab resources. So anytime you are in a situation of either human beings or animals, even in the animal kingdom, you will notice that they will try to maximize their survival. And in order to maximize their survival, they'll make groups, and these groups will inevitably come in conflict with each other, right? Now, I'll give you an example in this reading of uh, what such a theory predicts. Now, one of the most important theories in international relations is called structural realism. Now, structural realism is a theory which was propounded by a academic called Kenneth Waltz. This theory believes that the world actually is in a kind of anarchy. Now, by anarchy, we don't mean chaos. By anarchy, what Kenneth Waltz was saying is that there is no sovereign. That is, there is no world government. Suppose you are in a country and somebody attacks you. What will you do? You will pick up the phone and call the police to help you, to save you. But what can a country do? If a country is attacked, if a state is attacked, who will it call? Who will it pick up the phone and call? And even if they give a call, say to the United Nations, who will pick up on the other end? Which means that you are basically dependent on yourself. There is a word for this. This is called self-help. You're dependent only on self-help. So Kenneth Waltz says that since there is no world government, there is a general, uh, what he terms global anarchy. Therefore, there is each state to itself. So what will states do? Stronger states will try to build up large armies. When they do this, they create a situation called the security dilemma. Because when they build an army to protect themselves, they create fear in the other state, and the other state also ends up building its own defense. This again creates more fear in the first state, so they build up more, and it's a never-ending race to build a more powerful security force. So this is called the security dilemma. This is a never-ending arms race. Now, suppose you are a strong country, then you are okay. But if you're a weak country, what are you going to do? You're going to make alliances with other weak countries. By making alliances, you're going to try to balance the stronger country or the stronger alliance. This is called, there's a specific term in realism which is called balancing. You balance out the other by increasing your allies. You can also do something called internal balancing. What I just described was external balancing. Internal balancing is that the country tries to build up its internal resources in order to balance external threats. All right. So you can explain a lot of the conflicts, say the First World War, etc., and all of that, through this element of balancing. That is, France and Russia were afraid of Germany, so they made an alliance along with the Great Britain. Then Germany became afraid of these three, so it made an alliance with Austro-Hungary and Turkey. And this finally led to two large alliances, which, due to some misunderstandings, went to war. Now, similarly, you can explain the Cold War. The Soviet Union made an alliance, and the US made an alliance. One was called NATO, the other was called Warsaw Pact, and they tried to balance each other out. So, as I've explained to you, now I'll give you a quick example of this. Okay. This sheet kind of yeah. Here is an. I don't think you'll be able to read this, unfortunately, because this is too. Okay. So he's given 3 examples. One is what happened in the Cold War. Okay. So Kenneth Walls gives us an example that in 1988, he claimed that the Cold War was firmly rooted in the structure of post-war international politics and will last as long as that structure endures. That is, as long as the Cold War endures, and the structure will last. The Cold War will last as long as the bipolar structure endures. Now, the Cold War actually came to an end within a year or two. So, what happened? How did the uh, how did it come to such a quick end? Well, according to Kenneth Walls, this Cold War should have continued. But what he didn't take into account was that the Soviet Union was internally weak, growing weaker. That is, one of the two powers facing each other was not able to sustain the conflict. So he did not have case specific knowledge of what was happening inside the Soviet Union. So one of the things about realism is it's not enough to know the structure. You also need to know what is the relative power of the two sides. To know the relative power, you have to know what is the economic strength of the two rivals. Unfortunately, Soviet Union was a largely closed society, and it was not possible to get a full knowledge of its internal economic strength. And most people did not realize that the Soviet Union would collapse so quickly internally, leading to a change in the power structure. Another example that this book provides is that in the 1990s, another academic called John Mearsheimer argued that the end of the Cold War would lead to more war in Europe, because he has a theory called offensive realism. In offensive realism, the difference between Kenneth Walls' theory and Mearsheimer's theory is that Kenneth Walls believes in defensive realism. That is, countries will increase their power in order to defend themselves, and only up to that point. Mearsheimer believes that actually countries seek power and will keep seeking power until they are the only one left standing. This theory is called offensive realism, that actually all countries actually want a, something called hegemony. Hegemony means that they should be the most powerful actor in the system. They should be able to control the system. And it means a kind of monopoly of power. And he believes that countries will therefore go to war until and unless they have achieved this kind of a hegemony. So Mearsheimer was predicting that the end of the Cold War would lead to again war in Europe, because the balance of forces had been disturbed. So, but this major power war did not happen in Europe. Uh, so what was the problem with this application of realism? Was again that the Soviet Union's power had declined to a point where NATO was, that is effectively the United States, was unopposed. So I want to now go from here to another set of reading briefly, so that you can have a look at another set of ideas which have been propounded. The second reading is from Globalization of World Politics. And here I would like you to have a look at again again they focus on power and self-interest. That focus remains, but what we have, okay, I want to present to you one of the main dialogues of realism. This dialogue has been taken from the history of the Peloponnesian War. It is a dialogue between uh, Athens, and an island called Melos, the Melians. It's called the Melian dialogue. Okay, I'll send you across these two readings so that you can have a better look. Unfortunately, I don't have your emails right now. So the Melian dialogue is, Thucydides points out, between the Athenians and the Melians. Melians are a small island, and they are allies of Sparta. But Athens is more powerful at sea, so Athenians come to the Melians and say that you must stop supporting the Spartans. You must pay tribute to us, the Athenians, and you should become our vassal state. The Melians refuse this. They say, sorry, this is not just. You know, every state has the right to be independent. Every state has the right to self-respect and sovereignty and all of that. And the Athenians tell them that, look, there is no harm in bowing to someone who's more powerful. Otherwise, you will meet a bad end. So the Melians tell the Athenians that, look, you are strong today, but tomorrow you may be weak, like us. If you show us kindness today, tomorrow you will also be shown kindness. To which the Athenians refuse, saying that whoever has power will exert it. And when we will be weak, we will also not expect any mercy from you. We will pay our dues. This is the main aspect of realism that one must note, that it depends entirely on power relations. Trust, the real reason that you cannot depend upon trust is what leads to the security dilemma. The security dilemma is the other country has an army. That means it has the capability to attack you. Now, I cannot depend on that country's intentions, because intentions can change at any point. You see, I have to depend on that country's capabilities. So, for example, if Germany is powerful, but Germany is a democratic country, then you would say that it's okay, you know, we can trust Germany, it's okay, we don't have to go to war. On the other hand, the problem becomes that What if Germany tomorrow becomes a dictatorship? It still has that same immense power, and maybe it suddenly becomes aggressive. What will you do? That is, therefore, you focus not on the country's intentions, but you focus on the other party's capabilities, and you try to safeguard yourself. So this Melian dialogue summarizes that. The Melians did not pay tribute to the Athenians. In exchange, the Athenians came back with an army. They defeated the Melian army. They made slaves out of the women and children and sold them, and they destroyed the whole state, serving as a reminder to everybody that do not uh, resist Athens. So, so this is one of the classical examples of a realist dialogue. Now, I'll try and show you, if possible, one more example, one last example from this reading. So there was a war called the Vietnam War. I don't know if many of you are familiar with it. This happened between the United States and Vietnam, and Vietnam was much less powerful than the US. But the US lost this war. I don't know if you're aware of it. The reason for the US losing it was that Vietnamese were supported by the Chinese and the Russians, the Soviets, and after after a few years of guerrilla warfare, had suffered large losses, going to withdraw. Even though they did not lose the war, they actually won most of the battles, but they were forced to withdraw. Okay. Now, why do you think that happened? And one of the famous American academics, his name was Morgenthau, advised America not to enter this war. Okay. Now, why would Morgenthau advise America not to enter this war? You won't be able to see it, but I'll try and open it up for you here. This is the reading. I don't know if it's clear on the if it's clear. So why would Morgenthau oppose the US entry into Vietnam? Vietnam is a weaker country. America is stronger. But Morgenthau opposed America's entry into Vietnam. And America had entered into Vietnam because of a particular theory also. This theory was called the Theory of Dominoes, which believed that Southeast Asia, if it turns communist, one country turns communist there, then the others will also turn communist one by one. They will fall like dominoes. So they tried to oppose communism earlier with in Malaysia, that is, then in Indonesia, then finally in Vietnam and Cambodia. So Morgenthau said that suppose even if Southeast Asia turns communist, that is not our main problem. Why? Because according to realism, we have to focus on where the power lies. And where is the world's power? The world's industrial power is either in North America or it is in Western Europe. And nowadays it is in East Asia, that is in China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. So most of the world's industrial power is not in Southeast Asia. In those days, it was very poor. So he says that if you are going to put resources, American soldiers there, and at one point, America had very large resources in Southeast Asia, almost 500,000 soldiers and naval personnel and Air Force personnel stationed there. What will happen is that you will weaken yourself in other areas, he said. So you will draw down from forces from Europe. Thereby, you will expose yourself to a Soviet counterattack in Europe, or say a Soviet counterattack in Japan, because Japan is also a US ally, uh, or a Chinese counterattack in Korea. And you will, first of all, end up weakening America, and you will end up weakening the uh, battlefields in which America potentially faces its rivals. Therefore, Morgenthau was saying, conserve your strength. Do not send forces into Vietnam. And ultimately, that's what happened. America sent so many forces, started losing some forces, and the American economy started weakening. And America was not able to keep up its commitments in Europe, and there was hyperinflation in America. Finally, America was forced to withdraw forces from Vietnam, so as to again strengthen American forces in Europe and Japan and Korea, and prevent hyperinflation in the US. So finally, America had to withdraw from Vietnam because they did not listen to Morgenthau. They did not listen to conserving their power. So again, one of the main principles of realism, that is, you have to conserve your power to meet potential threats. In this way, you can also understand what is happening in South Asia. South Asia is the region of India, Pakistan, and China. What exactly is happening here? India faces China, and India also faces Pakistan, right? Now, Pakistan is the weaker country, India is the stronger country, but China is the most strong country. So therefore, India does not behave very aggressively with China because China is capable of inflicting much more damage. How do we know that? We know that from a simple reason. China's GDP per capita is almost 5 times India's GDP per capita. That is, China is 5 times richer. So for every one tank or plane that India can put in the battlefield, China can put 5 tanks, 5 planes. So India has therefore not tried to get back Chin or Ladakh, etc. India is okay with that area being with China, and similarly, Pakistan, despite whatever Pakistan may say, Pakistan is not about to attack India to get Kashmir because of India's power. China is happy that Pakistan is India's rival because that ties down India's strength. India-Pakistan rivalry ties down India's strength, so India does not have to, therefore, free forces in order to face down China. So China is happy to support Pakistan. Pakistan also does external balancing. Why? Because Pakistan always keeps an ally. It is too weak to face India alone, so it keeps an ally either by interfering in Afghanistan, or it does it by making alliances with America. Sometimes now it makes alliances with China in order to counterbalance India. Pakistan also ties down India's forces in Kashmir through insurgency. This reduces India's conventional strength over Pakistan. Pakistan has also managed to get nuclear weapons, just like India got nuclear weapons. India got nuclear weapons in order to counterbalance China's nuclear weapons, but then Pakistan also got nuclear weapons, and this helped reduce its power differential with India, because otherwise India is conventionally more powerful than Pakistan. So in this way, Pakistan has tried to balance India through Kashmir, through nuclear weapons. India tried to balance China through nuclear weapons. And India tries to also balance China through making alliances earlier with the Soviet Union. And now India's close alliance with the US is in order to counterbalance China. And the US also has made alliances with India in order to kind of reduce China's strength and counterbalance it. It's not China's strength, sorry, China's threat. And so all countries do internal balancing and external balancing. China has done internal balancing also, has become very powerful in order to face up to. Now the issue that many people are saying is that for a while the world has been having American hegemony, and now that China is rising, China is still much less powerful than the US. But since China has become more powerful than before, will there be a war? Because whenever there is a rising power, usually it results in war. We have seen that in the case of Sparta and Athens. We have seen that in the case of Germany and Great Britain. A rising Germany led to a war with Great Britain. So will a rising China lead to a war with the US? So far I have explained to you briefly the theory of realism. But I haven't explained to you the other theory of what is called liberalism. Liberalism predicts different outcomes. Realism also does not necessarily lead to war. This is only one aspect that I've told you, that is classical realism and offensive realism. According to structural realism, China will not go to war with the US because China's strength is still much less than the US, and the costs of war will be very high. So when you go to war, you calculate the cost versus the benefits. And the US will also try to prevent war because, again, the cost will be quite high. But they are both exerting their power. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Khan. Now we are open for question answers. I could see some of the questions are already there. I would request our participants to post questions related to the topic. I will take the first question from Ashria, and her question is, will there be a paradigm shift in realism as a school of thought as applied to the world post-COVID-19 pandemic? How will this public health emergency change the definition or dimension of core aspects of realism?
Is the question being typed?
Yeah, you can see the question in the question section on the control panel.
Okay. So somebody asked me, what is the name of the book from where I can gain all the information you are telling? That's one of the questions? Is that...
Yeah, that's one of the questions, but I'm referring to Ashraya's question. That's the first one.
Okay, 1 second. Let me just open this. Okay. Yeah. Will there be a paradigm shift in realism as a school of thought as applied to the world post-COVID pandemic? See, realism, there are several schools. I've told you about classical realism and I've told you about structural realism. But there are other schools such as neo-realism and offensive realism. So now, has there been a shift in realism? Sure, there has been some shift in realism even before. For example, now war is not that common as it used to be because there have been some changes. What are the changes? The changes are that in the world today, it is much more expensive to go to war. It's very costly, and so you try to avoid that. Also, the benefits from war are much less. Earlier times, the benefits were that you could capture another country's territory or oil resources. Now, most of the country's wealth is in their technology, that is in their human capital, and so that's very difficult to capture through war, you know. Countries have started trying to avoid war and have been trying to gain through uh, trade. But if you are, say, uh, 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 even in today's times, uh, realism has not disappeared. So, for example, countries will exert influence over each other in other ways. You know, for example, uh, some countries will try to spread their values. For example, the US will try to spread democracy, will try to spread human rights. Uh, Russia will, for example, try to prevent that. You know, it will try to, Russian government will try to prevent the spread of democracy. So will the Chinese government. They will try to spread, they'll try to prevent it and keep also exerting. The Chinese government wants more larger sphere of influence, you know, in Southeast Asia, for example. So it will try to prevent US from exerting its power in East Asia. The US wants to continue exerting its power because it doesn't want China's authoritarian model or China's power to influence the countries uh, around it. So even though war has become less in the world today, there are other ways. So I don't think COVID is going to change realism. It's an old theory, and it claims to be a theory of human nature. Human beings will continue to uh, be selfish. According to this theory, human beings will continue to value power, and power will still determine how outcomes happen. And human beings will continue to be in groups as group animals in countries. So I don't think there will be a big change post COVID uh, about with respect to realism. How will this public health emergency change the definition or dimensions of core aspects of realism? I don't think it will change the core aspects of realism. Core aspects of realism have changed to some extent in the, as I explained, in the last 100 years, but because of economic and technological change. Technology keeps changing all the time, and that changes the costs and the benefits of going to war. But as you can see from the rivalry between the US and China today in East Asia, that it has not ended. You know, realism still has an important. So it's a good question, Arshia, but I don't think there's going to be any big changes. Do realism and globalization go hand in hand? Actually, globalization is better understood if you apply the theory of liberalism. Realism, so realism is very interested in power. That is, it is interested in relative power, specifically speaking. What do I mean by that? Uh, Realism cares about how powerful you are relative to me. It doesn't matter how powerful I am and how powerful somebody else is. What matters is the relative power, relative to each other, because that will determine my security and my influence. So realism and globalization would be better. Globalization and realism really don't go hand in hand. Though you can take benefit of globalization if you are a realist. I'll give you an example. Uh, China has taken advantage of realism. Sorry, of globalization. Why? It found globalization was a good way to increase its power. Why? Because through exporting to other countries, it can improve its economy. So it used globalization to increase its power. Similarly, the US also used globalization. How did the US use globalization? The US thought that by globalization, you will get free trade, and free trade will make America richer because American companies can invest abroad. America can import cheap goods from China. So it will make America richer. It did not focus on relative power, America. It focused on absolute power, which is a mistake according to realism. You should focus on relative power according to realism. But America did one clever thing. By doing globalization with China, by doing trade with China, America has made China into a capitalist country. China used to be a communist country. So America has basically made China less of a economic ideological threat. When China was communist, it was a uh, opposing economic system. So America has made China into a capitalist system, but by doing that, it has made China more powerful. So now America was hoping that as China becomes capitalist, it will also become more democratic. That has happened, but only to a small extent. That is, China has now much more local self-government, local democracy. In fact, China's local democracy and local self-government is better than India's in many respects. But at the top, China has not had that much democracy. And Americans or people who believe in free trade and capitalism will say that it is inevitable that China will also become democratic, just like Taiwan became democratic, just like South Korea, which was not democratic, has now become democratic. Just like all of these countries have become democratic, it is inevitable that China also will become democratic. So let's see. So yes, US has tried to use globalization for its realist objectives. China has definitely successfully used globalization for its realist objectives. So let's look at something else.
Professor Khan, we have a
Yeah.
student, Aniket, who wants to know what book to refer in order to read more about this topic.
So yeah, so I have these two readings. I'm sending you both these readings, and you can read these two readings. I have these two readings. I don't know how to send them. I have them on my laptop right now. I have not figured out the system about how to share.
You
There
can
is
share it
something
with
called,
me. I will forward it to all the participants.
yeah, yeah. So there is some. I'll send it to you. These two readings, and I want you to share it with everybody. And one of them is from a book called The Globalization of World Politics. I'm going to write it for you. And the other reading is from a book called Foreign Policy Analysis. So from both these books, I've got these two readings, and I think you will enjoy reading them and understanding them. Just one quick question was here. I just want to address it. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States entered an arms race and started developing high-tech weaponry. Would that be an example of internal balancing? Uh, Developing high-tech weaponry is an example of internal balancing. Yes, correct. And finding allies abroad is an example of external balancing. So when they found allies outside, that's an example of internal balancing. Since China is growing in power, plus many other countries are increasing in strength, so is the world heading towards bipolarity or multipolarity? So simple, I'll try to simplify this for you. Right now, the US remains the most powerful country in the world, but the US seems to be withdrawing from the world in the last 5 to 10 years. And so China is becoming more powerful, but China is still much less powerful than the US. So other countries are also increasing in power, but they don't have that much power, Um, so the European Union has a certain amount of power. If Europe can maintain itself and stay together, then Europe might come up as a power. But right now, you could say, yeah, right now you could say China, it's basically the US, and China has some power also. But I won't say the world, right now it's difficult to say if the world is unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar. It's difficult to say right now. In the 90s, it was easy to say. In the early 2000s, the world was clearly unipolar, but now it's more like, I won't call it bipolar also, because it's not like earlier. Yeah, I would say that we are in some in-between stage. Yeah, in some in-between stage between unipolar and multipolar. So let me see. Is self-determination for Kashmir a realist aspect for the state of India? Wow, there are a lot of questions. Okay. Is self-determination for Kashmir a realist aspect for the state of India? I did not understand that question. Uh, uh, is it, I'm assuming you are asking that is self-determination for Kashmir a realist question for India, for the state of India? Yes, it's a realist question for the state of India. Why? Because Kashmir has three aspects. The first aspect is that it gives India a certain increase in territory, but there's also a problem. It costs India a lot of resources to maintain that in terms of army and air force and military. India also spends a lot of money on the administration, so civil administration. So it's very costly for India. Now you will have to do a cost-benefit analysis to know whether it is enough. If you do a cost-benefit analysis, India does not get much out of Kashmir apart from some hydroelectricity. So is it beneficial for India? Then I don't know. Strategically, is it beneficial for India? I don't know, really speaking, if it is strategically beneficial. It does give India some extra territory, but is it strategically beneficial? That's difficult to say. It might give India some extra room to protect itself. Is it psychologically beneficial for India? India believes so, yeah, that it is psychologically beneficial because they believe that it increases India's reputation. To lose Kashmir would reduce India's reputation. So psychologically, it would have an effect. So yeah, we'll have to look at it in various ways. Uh, if you want to look at it in a realist way, you will have to look at cost benefits, the power that you get out of Kashmir, or that you don't get power. It reduces your power. Does it reduce your power with respect to China? Does Kashmir reduce your power with respect to Pakistan, or does it increase your power? All of those things will have to be looked at. Can the money that is spent on Kashmir be used somewhere else more productively? All of those things will have to be looked at for realism. So last question, this question was, it was because Vietnam was divided into North and South Vietnam and they were siding with USSR. Okay, that's not a question, it's a comment. So can you give a present example of realism? Present example of realism, I gave you already, the way all the countries were trying to grab medical supplies during this COVID crisis. That's an example. Another example would be what's going on in Syria right now. Russia is trying to increase its power by interfering in Syria so that they can maintain a base there, a naval base as well as a air base. Another example is what's going on between the US and North Korea on nuclear issues. They're both trying to exert their power, and North Korea is trying to be secure. What is happening between, for example, Iran and the US right now? Yeah, it's a question of realist power. Iran is trying to increase its influence in the Middle East, and America is trying to limit it. So there are many examples. Realism is always in. Sir, can you please suggest me a book from where I can get all the information? Okay, that I've done. Sir, could you please elaborate on the contrast between groupism being one of the elements of realism but USA lost the Vietnam War due to groupthink, which means extreme coercion, then how is it possible for this war to be an example of realism? Is it necessary for all the elements to be present in a particular situation to qualify a realism-based situation? So to answer this question, you have asked a complex question. You will have to do the reading. The short answer for your question is that realism requires you to look at a situation. You can even look at a situation in domestic Indian politics, for example. For example, you can look at what's happening between the Congress and the BJP, or what the Prime Minister is doing, in elections. What, for example, happened in the Delhi elections is an example of realism, actually. There was a lot of identity-based politics and emotional politics being used in order to influence the vote. For example, also there was a lot of emphasis on money being spent in elections. That is an example of power, how much money you can spend in an election. For example, if you saw the other day, you saw that many of the chief ministers of the state are bowing in front of the prime minister. The reason is the prime minister still controls the resources for the state chief ministers. If you noticed, the governor in Maharashtra was creating problems for the chief minister in Maharashtra. And so the chief minister had to make a phone call to the prime minister. You can see that in a lot of things, realism in politics is evident. A lot of our politics is done with the help of money power. This money power comes from businessmen for political parties. If you see what happened, so that's another example of realism in politics, and there are many examples, for example, Prime Minister Modi going to China and meeting Xi Jinping right after the Doklam event, the Doklam confrontation. This was an example of realism. The Prime Minister was going there because China was more powerful. Because, for example, the Prime Minister did not go to Pakistan after Balakot because Pakistan is less powerful. So he doesn't feel scared of Pakistan, but for China. So that's an example of realism where you respect power. Okay, so the idea of deterrence rather than the security. The deterrence is part of the security dilemma. In fact, they are often the same thing. They are not different. Deterrence is similar to security dilemma. I want to clarify. Okay, and yes, yes. What is the? So there are two questions, and the biggest model. No, that's not necessary. Yes, you're right. USA is the biggest exporter of weapons, but that is not the reason that USA wants conflict in other parts of the world. These conflicts are happening due to the power situation in that area, the relative power situation in that area, the security dilemma or the threat or the deterrence in that area. So, for example, America is not causing India-Pakistan war or India-Pakistan conflict. America is not causing India-China conflict. That is too simple an explanation. That is a kind of a conspiracy theory. So it's a very interesting question asked. He's saying that realism and liberalism are conflicting theories, and which one do you believe is prevailing in the world right now? So for that, we'll have a separate webinar We will look at liberalism, and then I will compare realism to liberalism. We'll have a separate webinar for that. Okay, that's a long question. You are right. Liberalism and realism have differences, some differences. There are some similarities also between them. I'll explain later. Okay, so there was a sentence in one of the readings, I'm not sure, but I think it was within egoism. Inhumanity is humanity under pressure. I'm not sure if I agree. Maybe you could elaborate your understanding of this. Oh, this is a great question. So realists believe that inhumanity is humanity under pressure, that when people become inhuman, they are human beings under pressure. I also don't agree with this statement completely. Okay. For example, there are many times that people become inhuman without pressure. For example, in riots, in communal riots, or for example, when they treat, so what the Jews, happened to the Jews in the Holocaust, or for example, what happened in Rwanda. But realism still matters. I don't agree with the statement that inhumanity is humanity under pressure, because sometimes people are inhuman just because they enjoy being inhuman, right? It's not because they are under some kind of pressure to be inhuman. Sometimes people are inhuman because they are under pressure. That also happens. What do I mean by that? That means suppose there is a war, and they have to therefore kill the enemy and all of that. Okay? But many times people do mass killings, and the reason is not because they are under pressure, but realism still matters, because the reason they could do the mass killing is because the opposing side was less in power. So the reason that Germans could kill Jews was because Jews were less powerful. The reason that Palestinians get kicked around is because Israel is more powerful. The reason that Rwanda happened between Hutus and Tutsis is because Tutsis were less powerful compared to Hutus at that time. If there is a communal riot and one ethnicity suffers, then it is because they are weak and the other one is got more power at that time, because either they control the police or they control the army, or the other side controls the government, the media. So so power still matters. That's what I'm trying to tell you. What could be a major solution for reducing hostilities between the countries? An independent UN, not dominated by anyone, or a world government? Very difficult to do that, because how will you have a world government? The world government should have its own army and police force. How will it have that? No country will agree. See, and the more powerful country will not agree. The more powerful countries will want to keep their power. You see, so the UN is for now ineffective. And how can you reduce hostilities? Yeah, it's a good question. Usually, the one of the best ways to reduce hostilities is to have uh, democracy spread all over the world. That's one way you can have, because democratic countries usually don't go to war with each other. Another way is for liberalism to spread throughout the world. Liberalism means freedom, and liberal countries also usually don't go to war. So the spread of liberalism, most of the countries that go to war are illiberal countries, right? And so one way is for liberalism to spread throughout the world. And I'll explain to you, I'll do a separate class on liberalism. And that is one way to prevent conflict in the world. If all countries became liberal, then you would have a more peaceful world. And what is the name of the book? What is the name of the book from where I can gain all the information? Okay. All right. So I think I've covered a lot of your questions. I've not given detailed answers. For example, how can there be less conflict? Would be if there is more free trade, if there's more liberalism in all the countries slowly, if all the countries are at a similar level of technology and power. That could be another way to reduce conflict. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Khan. I think you know it is very evident from so many questions that today's webinar was definitely very interesting and very informative. And I think some of the they could refer to some of the books that you mentioned, some of the readings that you mentioned. I would also be emailing them these two readings, and they could go and do some homework as well. Uh, so with this, I really appreciate your time, to conduct this webinar. And as you said, we will again do another webinar on liberalism, and I hope to see a similar turnaround of students, and we can definitely discuss more on that. Uh, I also want to make a quick important announcement to all the applicants, candidates, students. Uh, this is regarding your JSAT. So most of the students, they were in touch with me in terms of how to give the JSAT, considering the lockdown, because they are not able to find a center. The centers have not opened. So the good news is Pearson View, the test taking agency, they would be starting from Monday onwards. Their registration will be open for your test that you can take from home. So you would not need to go to any of these test centers. Rather, you can take these tests from home, and these are 24/7. Saying that, a lot of students who have already registered for the JSAT, you will receive a notification or an email from us, from our team, very soon. We will try and connect with you to understand whether you want to take the JSAT, maybe this month, because most of you have selected a date in June, considering if there is an extension in the lockdown this month, then it's better to take it next month. However, you will have the flexibility now to take the test anytime from anywhere, right? So I would request you to discuss this. Uh, you will also have a lot of sample papers on the Pearson website. So please go and download those sample papers, start preparing this weekend, because ideally I would request you to take at least a week's time to prepare before you take the test. In the meantime, we will keep you posted. We are still waiting for some more communication from the test taking company, Pearson View, and our team will reach out to you with more information regarding this. So with this, I thank everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Khan, for this webinar today, and we will again come back with some interesting topics. Also, a quick note to everyone: we are planning for a webinar with our current students who wants to discuss about life in JSIA. So this would be addressed by our current students. I'm sure you would be excited to hear from them, their experience. So please stay tuned. We will inform you. We will send you the invite. We look forward for your participation. Thank you and have a good day.
Okay, thank you.